Okay, well, we're here at the Santa Monica Pier because it's a great spot to shoot some night photography and get those nice long shutter speeds. And we got several lighting items behind us. We've got this big Ferris wheel. We've got a roller coaster. We've got the ocean right in front of me here with some nice, we can get some nice slow shutter speeds there and get some nice blurred action on the waves. Places like this are a great opportunity to take your camera out at night and explore. All you really need is a camera that's capable of shooting in low light. These new Canons are great for that. They have ISO capabilities that go well with night photography and give you really beautiful images with low amount of noise, low amount of grain. And if you slap one of these on a tripod, you're pretty much ready for some slow shutter speed night photography.
Well, before we start to talk about things like ISO and shutter speed, it's important to note that anytime you want to go out and take pictures at night, you want to bring a tripod. And even though cameras these days have extremely high success rate shooting at high ISOs and delivering very little noise to the image, you still want to take a tripod with you anyway so that you can shoot at the lowest ISO possible. But not only that, you're able to capture images that at slow shutter speeds with tripods in ways that you really couldn't with just a handheld approach or some other rigging technique. Now here's three basic tripods that are kind of gimmicky, kind of fun, but they just give you a sense of how much variety is out there on the market now when it comes to camera stabilization. A lot of these ones here are just designed for simple point and shoot cameras or for situations where you're just going to put this in your pocket and be ready to shoot family photos. But nonetheless, anything that can help stabilize your camera could be useful. Here on the more serious end, we've got some SLR tripods that are very lightweight and quite inexpensive. They come in different varieties, and it really just depends on how much money you want to spend and how much durability you're looking for. But you know, even these little plastic tripods like the one there on the left that you can pick up at your local discount store for under $100 can be very useful. And you don't need anything too fancy to go out and just shoot with a DSLR camera. These cameras are lightweight. You don't need a really heavy-duty tripod to succeed with these. But if you are looking for doing very fluid motions when it comes to using video on your camera, if you're looking to do pans and tilts that are very fluid, very smooth, very soft, then you're going to want to look towards getting a tripod with a better head. And you know, that just refers to the top portion of the tripod that has some sort of system for allowing you to do tilts and pans like you will see there on the left. Now, you can also find monopods out there, and this is a unique one in that this monopod actually converts into a simple tripod. But monopods are also great for keeping things lightweight, for going on travel photography jaunts and just taking this out, putting it on your backpack, you know, and then taking it out when you need it. Running around with this is very lightweight. It doesn't weigh you down like a normal tripod would. And there are certain locations, like certain museums, for example, that won't let you in there with the tripod anyway. So having a monopod is the next best thing, and this thing will allow you to take fairly stable images without the luxury of a very stable tripod, but keeping it lightweight and still fun to use.
Well, if you've played around with your camera's ISO setting, then you probably know that the ISO settings go hand in hand with noise. The higher the ISO setting, the more noise you usually get. Now that varies depending on the camera model you have and the size of the CMOS sensor inside the camera. Now with certain cameras, you can get very good results and very low noise at high ISO settings, perhaps even in the 1600 to 3200 range. But with cameras with smaller chips, smaller sensors inside, you're going to have more noise when you use these higher ISO settings, so just be wary of that. And if you do happen to have a slower camera or a camera that has a smaller size chip, then make sure you've got a tripod available and you're going to be sticking to those low ISO settings to keep your images noise-free and grain-free.
If you've looked at all at SLR camera lenses, you already know that it's very expensive to get telephoto high-end camera lenses that can open up to f2 or f2.8. And in general, it's always a challenge to find good camera lenses for the right amount of money for most people's budgets that can handle those wider apertures. So that automatically points us towards shutter speed and ISO when it comes to making our camera more light sensitive for night photography. Shutter speed can do a lot, and we're going to take a look at some images that play with using long shutter speed exposures. But when you're trying to take images at night that use a faster shutter, say for example if people are posing for you, or if you have a little bit of action involved in the movement you don't want to blur, then you're always going to have to choose ISO as the main element to help you out when it comes to exposure. So here's a couple charts that show you side-by-side comparisons of different cameras and their relative ISO settings and how much noise that produces. But the bottom line is the trade-off for using a higher ISO number is going to be your camera's noise, the digital noise that's added to the image as a result of that higher ISO setting. Now, newer cameras are getting better and better at adding less noise to the image, but this really depends primarily on the size of the image sensor. And so for those people who have invested in more expensive SLR cameras that have larger image sensors, they can greatly benefit from those higher ISO settings. And they're capable of using ISOs in the 1600 to 3200 range and still get very clean results. But a lot of this is subjective. It really comes down to also the type of photographs you're taking and whether or not you can tolerate noise in those images. But here, looking at this comparison on the right, for example, you can see that the 1D Mark III has a little tighter grain structure than, say, the 40D or the 30D. But depending, again, on the image sensor size, that will vary from camera to camera. So here's a look at some of the different image sensors out there. And I know there's a lot there to digest, especially on the left, but just for a quick argument's sake or comparison's sake, take a look at the 1/2-inch Sony chip that goes with the Sony EX3. Now that's a fairly expensive camcorder when it was released, and it's sold for about $9,000 upon its initial release. And I'm not sure what the current going rate is. That probably depends on when you're listening to this. But the bottom line is that 1/2-inch sensor really pales in comparison when you look at a camera like the 1D Mark IV or the 5D Mark II or the Nikon D3S. You notice those cameras all just dwarf that little Sony several times over, and as a result are going to give you more sensitivity in low light situations. On the right there, you've got a comparison with two newer cameras, and newer as I record this, the 7D and the 5D Mark II. And you noticed with those two cameras, which are relatively close in terms of pricing, you'll notice there's a large difference in the image sensor of the Mark II versus the 7D. Now here's a chart that shows the noise levels versus ISO of one particular camera, in this case the EOS 5D Mark II. And you can see from looking at this chart, if you look at those ISO settings there on the bottom, you don't really need to understand all the nuances of this chart, but just simply look at that number 1600, and you notice that right after 1600, and then particularly as you get up in towards the 4000, the 5000, the numbers here on red, if you look at that line, significantly increase. And so we're starting to see a lot more noise as soon as we get past 1600. Now, from 50 all the way to 1600, we're fairly stable. I mean, we're going up and down depending upon the ISO you're using, but there's definitely a sharp increase in noise once you pass that 1600 threshold. Now, so that's kind of the threshold with this particular camera for noise. Now, again, it's a subjective thing. You might be totally fine with the noise levels at 4000 ISO. It's up to you. But you'll notice from this chart, you can see a certain trend there, and that's going to happen with most cameras. I want you to notice something else, though. Look at what happens between 50 and 1600. You notice that the red line is going up and down, and that's maybe a surprise to you, because you might be thinking, well, why doesn't that chart just simply go consistently up the further right that it goes. Why would it go up and down? The reason for that is at certain ISOs, you can call them clean ISOs or what have you, but these ISOs are not adding any gain to the image to create that extra light sensitivity. And you notice they happen incrementally. So we have there at 160, we have a clean ISO, and it's interesting to note that the noise is actually a little bit lower than it is at 100. And then you notice it goes up when you go to 250, and then it comes down again at 320. So if you look at 320 and 160, they're relatively close in terms of noise levels. Then you go to 640, and then you go to 1250, and it's, again, it's interesting to see that mean just kind of ebb and flow with those numbers. So there are certain ISO settings that will actually deliver cleaner results by the fact that they're not adding gain to the image.
Fairgrounds like this one offer all kinds of opportunity to capture motion. Here at nighttime, you can get these beautiful lights going, and with fairgrounds and rides like this one, you've got all kinds of things that you can point the camera at and get some interesting looking shots. Whether you want to take portraits or just want to take some landscapes or close-up shots of lights, you can get some really interesting abstract work as well as practical things that you can use in your portfolio. Using slow shutter speed is a great way to get some amazing shots at night, and especially when you have situations where lights are moving around or when you have people in movement, you can get some great looking shots. But a lot of times people forget that the contrast between things that are not in motion or are focused or sharp against the blurred backgrounds can make for really interesting photographs as well. Even when your camera's on a tripod, you can create unwanted motion just by tripping the shutter. By that simple act of your hand touching the camera, you can create camera vibration. So having a remote shutter trip like this one can go a long way towards preventing that problem. Some of these remote shutter trips have cables like this one, some of them use infrared systems, but basically they allow you to take pictures without actually touching the camera. That can have a lot of advantages, especially when you're on long exposures, long shutter speeds, where vibration can really be an issue. Another little trick is to put your camera on some sort of automatic shutter mode so that you're continuously taking pictures. Most cameras can take continuous pictures if you put it in the right mode, and if that is the case, then by the second or third photograph, your camera is going to be stable because your finger's already on the camera taking those shots. So little things that you can do to minimize vibration on the camera itself when you're taking these long exposures. A lot of times people assume that when you're shooting people at night, you're always going to need a flash. And if you have a tripod and you're capable of using a higher ISO setting on your camera, a lot of times you can use available light like this one to light your subjects. It can often provide a more pleasing form of light. In some cases, the light reflects off of other surfaces and gives you a really soft quality. In other cases, like this one, you have a natural diffusion there with the glass element that's diffusing the light as it comes out. And so sometimes you'll get actually better quality lighting out of fixtures like this one than you would out of your flash, which is often a little bit too bright, a little bit too obtrusive.